The winter wind bit through the shutters of the small Neapolitan villa, rattling them with a restless insistence, as though the past itself demanded entry. Inside, beneath the muted glow of a brass lamp, sat an aging man whose name once carried the gravity of a continent. Salvatore Luciano, known to the world simply as Luciano, the exiled king of an empire that had no borders and yet touched every port, every dock, every corridor of power, leaned forward in his chair, staring at the brittle pages of an old ledger. His fingers trembled not from weakness but from memory. For even now, decades after the world cast him out, the decision that had sealed his fate pulsed like a living thing in his mind. People spoke of his final pact in hushed tones, a rumor woven through FBI files, whispered in waterfront bars, and retold by men who claimed they once shook his hand. The truth was simpler, and far more dangerous. It was the sort of truth that governments denied, enemies feared, and allies pretended not to know. It was the truth that a fallen king, stripped of his throne but not his influence, had bartered the only commodity he had left: his mind, his reach, and the remnants of an empire too entrenched to collapse with his exile. Tonight, as the air thickened with the scent of salt from the distant sea, Luciano allowed himself to return to the moment his destiny pivoted. Not the courtroom. Not the exile order. But earlier, much earlier, when the war loomed and the world trembled under the boots of tyrants. It was then that he made the choice that saved everything he had built. It was then he gambled his legacy not for freedom, not for redemption, but for survival. And survival, for a man like him, was never merely personal. He shifted in his chair, joints protesting with the quiet complaint of age. Outside, gulls cried into the night as though echoing the voices of the past, the commanders, the politicians, the brokers of power who once sought his counsel in shadows. Some called him a patriot. Others called him a traitor. The truth lay somewhere in the in-between, in that murky territory where loyalty becomes strategy and morality becomes a game of misdirection. Luciano exhaled slowly. He had made many deals in his lifetime, but only one haunted him. One deal that had rewritten the balance of power in New York, reshaped alliances overseas, and embedded his influence in places where no court could reach. It was the deal of a lifetime, his last gambit. And though the world believed him finished, his arrangement had not only ensured the survival of men loyal to him but had shielded the very backbone of his empire long after his forced departure. Yet even now, as he traced the inked names on the ledger, the soldiers, the capos, the lieutenants, he wondered whether the price had been too high. Power preserved is not always power controlled. Influence maintained is not always influence welcomed. And secrets protected tend to grow teeth. A storm gathered along the coast, its distant rumble vibrating through the floor. Luciano closed the ledger and let his hand rest atop it, as though to cage the memories inside. He had been young then, ambitious, ruthless in ways age no longer allowed. The government had come to him not out of respect, but out of desperation. The war machine faltered. Sabotage crippled the docks. Fear spread faster than ammunition. And they, those self-righteous men in tailored suits, turned to the very criminal they pretended to despise. But that was the nature of power, it bent when necessary. Luciano's offer had been simple, elegant, and costly. He would secure the ports. He would stabilize the unions. He would ensure that the arteries feeding the war effort flowed without obstruction. But nothing came free, not even patriotism. His price was silence and a promise. Silence regarding his operations, and a promise that would shape the future of organized power for decades. The fire crackled in the grate, throwing shadows across his lined face. In those shadows, he could almost see the outlines of the men who had once stood at his side. Some remained loyal, others had betrayed him, and a few had risen on foundations he had quietly laid. An empire, even in absence, still requires its architect. And yet, the question lingered in the stale air: how does a fallen king save an empire he no longer controls? Luciano had answered that question long ago, with a pact that had never truly ended. A pact that had ensured the government's victory abroad while guaranteeing the survival of his influence at home. But the world was changing now. New rivals rose. Old alliances frayed. And whispers of the pact resurfaced like artifacts unearthed from a forgotten war. He looked toward the window where the moon carved a pale sliver across the ocean. "They think I'm finished," he murmured to the empty room. But a king's last move is never the one they expect. In the quiet that followed, the storm finally broke, rain striking the villa like 1,000 tapping fingers. Luciano allowed his eyes to close. Tomorrow perhaps he would confront the ghosts of that decision. Perhaps he would finally speak of the deal that preserved his empire, and ended his reign. But not tonight. Tonight the king remembered. Before the name Lucky Luciano ever echoed through backrooms and boardrooms across America, the criminal underworld was a fractured, volatile terrain, less an empire and more a battleground of old grudges and imported traditions. It was a world held together by blood oaths and broken apart by the very same. The immigrant neighborhoods that birthed it were crowded with desperation, and competition for survival had sharpened men into weapons long before they learned to aim their ambitions. Violence was not a tool, it was the entire language. In the early decades of the 20th century, the American underworld resembled a patchwork quilt stitched by unsteady hands. Every group, Italian, Jewish, Irish, Polish, Black and others, operated within its own insulated sphere, suspicious of outsiders and often equally suspicious of its own. Power structures were built on brittle hierarchies, inherited grudges and loyalties imported from villages thousands of miles away. What should have been strategy was instead nostalgia. What should have been enterprise was instead ritual. The old world thinking that clung to these organizations like dust weighed them down, chained them to codes that did little to protect them in a rapidly modernizing America. The Sicilian clans were among the most rigid, operating under the traditions of the Mano Nera, the Black Hand extortionists who terrorized their own communities as much as the outsiders they claimed to resist. Their methods were crude, letters soaked in threats, kidnappings disguised as warnings, and vengeance carried out with theatrical brutality. There was no centralized authority, no shared vision. Each boss was a sovereign, each neighborhood a kingdom, each conflict an inevitable spark. The smallest slight could ignite a feud that lasted years, claiming dozens of lives and achieving nothing except deepening chaos. Meanwhile, prohibition, meant to cleanse the nation, only poured gasoline into this fractured system. Liquor, now illegal, became the most valuable commodity on the streets, but instead of uniting the underworld, it tore it further apart. Dozens of different outfits scrambled for their piece of the bootlegging fortune. Trucks were hijacked, barges were sunk, distilleries were blown apart in midnight raids carried out not by law enforcement, but by competing gangs with axes to grind. Every new revenue stream invited new enemies. There was no stability, no predictability, no long-term vision. The underworld operated like a series of storms colliding, uncoordinated, destructive, and ultimately self-defeating. Among the Italian factions, the power vacuum was particularly disastrous. The so-called mustache Petes, aging traditionalists who clung to old Sicily like a fading memory, demanded obedience and rejected innovation. Their rule was absolute, suffocating, and increasingly impractical. They believed power came from fear alone. They refused alliances with non-Italians. They dismissed efficiency in favor of tradition. They punished ambition as if it were treason. Their world was shrinking, but they couldn't see it. And because they could not adapt, everyone around them was forced to suffer the consequences. Turf wars erupted as naturally as the changing seasons. Streets became battlefields. Young men who should have been building futures instead became soldiers in unwinnable conflicts sparked by misunderstandings, jealousies, or simple accidents of geography. One neighborhood belonged to one boss, another to his rival, yet the borders were invisible and constantly shifting. Any misstep, any misinterpretation of a gesture or rumor, could trigger bloodshed. These wars, frequent and senseless, drained resources and made long-term enterprise nearly impossible. Bootlegging operations stalled because drivers feared crossing into enemy blocks. Gambling dens shut down abruptly when a rival outfit firebombed a building 2 streets away. Protection rackets collapsed under the weight of overlapping claims. No one could plan beyond tomorrow. The Jewish organizations, though slightly more modern in their thinking, were trapped in their own cycles of conflict. Leaders rose quickly and fell even faster. Partnerships disintegrated under pressure. Informal alliances had the lifespan of a gunshot. The Irish mobs battled not only one another but the political machines that alternately empowered and exploited them. Their grip on certain cities was strong, but their internal fractures prevented them from capitalizing fully on their influence. Everywhere one looked, there were empires half built and half destroyed in the same breath. By the time the 1920s reached their peak, the American underworld was reaching a breaking point. There was money everywhere, more than anyone could have imagined, but no structure, no coordination, no shared discipline to manage it. Hundreds of powerful men stood atop islands of influence, but there was no bridge between them, only rivers of animosity. It was in this world of splintered loyalties and perpetual instability that the seeds of revolution quietly took root. Younger men, ambitious, sharper, unburdened by the feuds of the past, began to see the flaws that the mustache Petes could not. They recognized that the underworld could no longer afford to act like a handful of isolated tribes. America was too big, too fast, too modern. Opportunity was everywhere, but it required organization, vision, and, above all, peace. The old system was collapsing under the weight of its own stubbornness. It was a machine built for a different century. What the underworld needed was not just a leader but an architect. Someone capable of designing a structure stronger than any individual crew, more profitable than the sporadic chaos of turf wars, and intelligent enough to weave together rival factions without losing authority. Such a figure did not yet exist. But the conditions for his arrival were set. The disunity that strangled the underworld created the vacuum. The endless violence created the demand. The failures of the old guard created the opportunity. Before Lucky Luciano, the American underworld was a storm without an eye, powerful, destructive, but without direction. It needed order. It needed innovation. It needed someone who could see beyond bloodlines and traditions. It needed a king who understood that empires are not inherited. They are built. The Lower East Side at the turn of the century was less a neighborhood and more an ecosystem of survival, an overstuffed labyrinth of tenements where hope clung to life only because despair hadn't yet choked it out. Streets swarmed with barefoot children darting between pushcarts. Windows leaked the noise of too many families crowded into too little space. The smell of coal smoke, sewage, and aging produce clung to the air like a second skin. And in this crucible of poverty and promise, a boy named Salvatore Lucania began learning the language of ambition long before he knew the meaning of the word itself. His family, newly arrived from Sicily, carried little more than worn luggage and the aching belief that America would offer them the dignity their homeland had not. But the new world demanded more than optimism. Salvatore quickly realized that in a place where everyone was struggling, no one had time to save anyone else. You climbed or you were trampled. You adapted or you starved. These were not lessons taught in school. They were absorbed from alleyways, from whispered threats exchanged in stairwells, from the bruises of boys who learned too late that kindness was a luxury. Luciano, still known then as Sal, was not the biggest or the strongest among the neighborhood kids. But he was the one who watched. He paid attention to the subtleties most children overlooked. Who controlled which corner, who had the fastest hands, which shopkeepers were easily intimidated, which gangs had real power versus which ones only pretended. Even as a child, he understood that physical force mattered, but intelligence multiplied it. At school, he was restless, uninterested in lessons that had no bearing on the world outside. His true education waited for him on the sidewalks, where the immigrant gangs, Irish, Jewish, Italian, and everything in between, carved invisible borders through the city's poorest blocks. To some kids, these gangs were frightening. To others, they were glamorous. But to Sal, they were strategic models. Primitive, volatile, but undeniably functional. They operated on rules, however crude. They managed resources, however violently. They represented a form of power accessible to someone with nothing but nerve and wit. It didn't take long for Sal to test the waters. He started small, running errands for older boys, delivering messages, keeping lookout. His sharp instincts made him valuable, and his lack of fear made him memorable. By age 10, he understood leverage, how favors could be traded like currency, how loyalty could be bought with protection, how respect was not demanded but cultivated. He was building a reputation not through brashness but through reliability. Even then, he knew patience was as powerful as aggression. Yet the environment around him was equally important in shaping the man he would become. The immigrant slums were a paradox, a place where people dreamed loudly but lived quietly, crushed under the weight of poverty and discrimination. The police treated the neighborhood with either hostility or indifference. Landlords squeezed tenants dry. Employers paid starvation wages. This was not a world of equal opportunity, it was a world where opportunity had to be carved out of someone else's share. Sal watched his father labor long hours for meager pay, returning home exhausted, shoulders slumped under burdens he could not control. To young Sal it was a warning: honest work guaranteed nothing. The system was rigged. Power belonged to those who seized it, not to those who earned it through endurance. If anything, endurance was a trap. By adolescence, Sal gravitated toward the more organized street crews, groups that operated with growing sophistication. It was here he met boys who would become lifelong allies, and, eventually, influential figures in the American underworld. Among them was Meyer Lansky, a quiet-thinking mathematical prodigy whose intellect mirrored Sal's strategic mind. Their unlikely friendship, Sicilian and Jewish, street fighter and technocrat, would become one of the most consequential partnerships in criminal history. But at the time, they were simply two ambitious kids who recognized something rare in one another: focus. While other boys fought for dominance out of pride or anger, Sal and Meyer fought for control. They understood the long game. They understood that chaos was exploitable, and that the streets rewarded those who planned 3 moves ahead. Sal began running protection schemes, carefully calibrated so that the merchants felt both threatened and indebted. He collected debts, mediated disputes, and resolved conflicts with a pragmatism that unnerved even older youths. Violence, he learned early, was a tool, but only a fool relied on it exclusively. True power required subtlety, persuasion, and most of all, timing. By his mid-teens, Sal was no longer simply reacting to the world, he was shaping it. He adopted the name Charlie as both assimilation and armor, a persona designed to maneuver through American life with fewer obstacles. Eventually, Lucky joined the name, at first whispered half-mockingly, then uttered with respect, after he survived an attack that would have killed any ordinary street kid. His survival did not make him superstitious, it made him calculating. If life offered second chances, he intended to exploit every one. Yet beneath the bravado and the growing influence, the psychological foundation of Luciano's eventual empire was already forming. He had learned that loyalty mattered, but only when it was mutual. He had learned that fear could open doors, but vision kept them open. And he had learned that opportunity was rarely obvious. It hid in weaknesses, in fractures, in the spaces where others saw only chaos. His rise through the teenage gang hierarchies was not inevitable, it was engineered. Luciano studied people the way other boys studied textbooks. He learned to predict reactions, anticipate betrayals, and identify potential allies. He understood the value of diversity long before the word entered the corporate vocabulary. If he could unite skilled men across ethnic lines, he could build something larger than any neighborhood crew. A network. A blueprint. A future. By the time he reached adulthood, the shadows of the Lower East Side had done more than toughen him. They had refined him. They had created a man who viewed the world as negotiable, malleable, a chessboard waiting for a player with enough nerve to rearrange the pieces. The hardships that crushed others only sharpened his clarity. Luciano walked out of those tenements not as a survivor of poverty, but as a student of power. Every alleyway had taught him a principle. Every fight had taught him a limit. Every betrayal had taught him a cost. And every opportunity had taught him a truth he would carry into the negotiation that would forever change America. Power was not inherited. It was constructed. By the time Prohibition swept across the United States in 1920, most men in the criminal underworld saw it as a temporary opportunity, an unexpected windfall that could be exploited quickly before the inevitable repeal. But Charles "Lucky" Luciano saw something far greater. While others viewed illegal liquor as a product, he viewed it as infrastructure. While rivals scrambled to seize speakeasies and hijack trucks, he studied the entire system. Supply chains, distribution networks, enforcement vulnerabilities, political alliances, and the shifting loyalties that hovered like smoke above every corner of New York. Prohibition didn't just open a market, it exposed the inefficiencies of every gang still operating under old world rules. Luciano was ready. He had spent his youth studying human nature, alliances, and the mechanics of power. Now he studied the city with the same precision. New York was overcrowded with factions. Italian, Jewish, Irish, and countless independent crews, each fighting for dominance, each sabotaging its own potential through violence and short-sightedness. The mustache Petes, the aging Sicilian bosses who clung to tradition like armor, believed strength was demonstrated through isolation. Luciano believed the opposite. Strength was scalability. Strength was adaptability. Strength was unity built on profit, not heritage. The timing was perfect. The old Mafia structure was already buckling under its own weight, and the black market economy created by Prohibition revealed those cracks dramatically. The streets were awash in money, but the chaotic, tribal nature of the underworld made it impossible to harvest that wealth efficiently. Luciano recognized that any man who could impose order, not by force but by organization, would rule the future. His partnership with Meyer Lansky became the cornerstone of that vision. Lansky, quiet and analytical, provided the mathematical logic behind Luciano's strategic intuition. Where Luciano saw opportunity, Lansky calculated its cost, risk, and potential yield. Their dynamic was unprecedented across ethnic lines, but that was precisely Luciano's innovation. Talent mattered more than nationality, and profit mattered more than tradition. Bugsy Siegel, fiery and fearless, became their weapon of disruption. Siegel could intimidate, charm, or annihilate depending on the needs of the moment, and he delivered results with the kind of reckless charisma that terrified rivals. Together, Luciano, Lansky, and Siegel formed a triad of intellect, calculation, and force, a modern criminal board of directors. As bootlegging operations expanded, Luciano began constructing something the underworld had never seen before, a truly organized criminal enterprise. He built networks instead of territories. He forged partnerships instead of hostilities. He created streamlined channels where raw alcohol flowed from Canadian producers to New York distributors with assembly line efficiency. He replaced the unpredictable brutality of street crews with standardized procedures, payment schedules, transportation timetables, communication protocols, and profit-sharing models that incentivized loyalty. He ran crime like a corporation. And corporations need structure. The first step in modernizing the Mafia was dismantling its rigid, antiquated hierarchy. The Mustache Pete still operated under Sicilian customs that demanded unquestioning obedience, banned cooperation with non-Italians, and punished innovation as though it were betrayal. They clung to vendettas that stretched back generations, blind to the fact that America had its own rules, a different battlefield, a different set of opportunities. Luciano, in contrast, believed the past was useful only as reference, not doctrine. Tensions between the old guard and Luciano's rising faction escalated quickly. The Maranzano e Masuria conflict, better known as the Castellamarese War, became the breaking point. Years of bloodshed fractured the Italian underworld and left it vulnerable, confused, and exhausted. While the elders fought out of pride and vengeance, Luciano fought for the future. He maneuvered between factions, appearing loyal to both Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano while quietly orchestrating their downfall. Masuria fell first, killed in a Coney Island restaurant in a meticulously coordinated hit involving both Italian and Jewish gunmen, a symbolic repudiation of old world rules. Maranzano lasted only months longer. After he attempted to crown himself boss of all bosses, Luciano struck again, eliminating him through a team of assassins disguised as tax agents. In one decisive stroke, the centuries-old Mafia hierarchy crumbled. With the old guard gone, Luciano began building the structure that would define American organized crime for generations. The Commission. It was a governing body designed not around a single leader, but around balance. Representatives from the major families would meet, negotiate disputes, and set policy. Violence became a last resort rather than a first impulse. Profit became the measure of success. Luciano was not simply creating order, he was creating sustainability. Prohibition fueled this machine with unprecedented wealth. The Commission oversaw everything from bootlegging to gambling, narcotics to extortion, unions to political bribery. Luciano's genius was recognizing that criminal operations mirrored legitimate industries. Businesses needed protection, labor control, distribution efficiency, and predictable cash flow. He provided all of that, through intimidation when necessary but far more often through sophisticated organization. He brokered alliances across ethnic boundaries, forming partnerships with Jewish syndicates led by Lansky and Siegel, with Irish mobs controlling key docks and political machines, and with independent operators whose skills complemented the larger strategy. Luciano was not interested in ruling over others, he was interested in orchestrating them. Anyone could be useful. Anyone could contribute. Anyone could profit. This level of integration made the empire vast and vulnerable. A system this large required insulation. Rival factions were no longer the only threat. The government itself was beginning to recognize the scale of the criminal network forming under its nose. Prohibition revenues were staggering, and federal agencies, pressured by moral reformers and political agendas, were becoming more aggressive. Luciano understood earlier than most that his empire could not simply outgun the government. It would need to outmaneuver it. Influence became as valuable as violence. Control of unions allowed him to disrupt or preserve critical economic functions. Control of politicians allowed him to predict threats and manipulate legislation. Control of the docks and shipyards gave him leverage far beyond New York. For all its success, Luciano's empire carried a fundamental contradiction. It thrived in the shadows but depended on systems that operated in daylight. The more efficient it became, the more noticeable it became. And the more noticeable it became, the more the government's attention sharpened. The seeds of his dilemma were already growing. How do you protect a criminal empire that has grown too large to hide? How do you shield operations whose scale makes them indispensable to industries the government relies upon? And most dangerously, how do you maintain power when the only institution capable of destroying you is the very one you may one day need to negotiate with? Luciano had built something unprecedented, an empire woven into the economic, political, and social fabric of America. But every structure, no matter how sophisticated, casts a shadow. And in that shadow lurked the inevitable truth. If the government ever turned its full force against him, no alliance, no network, no commission would be enough. Unless, of course, he found a way to turn the government itself into an ally. That possibility, unthinkable in the early days of his ascent, would soon become the most audacious calculation of his life, the one move even his closest partners could never have predicted. Long before Lucky Luciano reshaped the American underworld, the Mafia's foundation rested on a single, unyielding principle: omerta. More than a rule, more than a warning, it was a worldview forged in the hills of Sicily, where trust was scarce, outsiders were threats, and the law was an enemy rather than a refuge. Omerta demanded silence in the face of danger, secrecy in the face of scrutiny, and loyalty so absolute that betrayal was punishable not only by death, but by the erasure of one's name, lineage, and honor. It was the glue that held criminal clans together in a landscape hostile to their survival. But once transplanted into America, a land of rapid development, modern policing, and competitive criminal enterprise, the ancient code began to show its limitations. The Sicilian elders clung to omerta as a sacred covenant, yet they interpreted it rigidly, conflating silence with stagnation, loyalty with unquestioning obedience, and tradition with strength. They believed the code demanded isolation. Italians dealt only with Italians, business flowed only through familiar channels, and innovation was treated with suspicion. For years this rigidity protected the clans, but at a tremendous cost. It prevented growth, discouraged partnerships, and suffocated ambition. It chained the underworld to a past that no longer reflected its reality. And it was within this suffocating framework that Charles Lucky Luciano emerged as both a savior and a heretic. Luciano respected omerta, not as an unbreakable relic but as a strategic tool. Silence was essential in any clandestine world. Loyalty was crucial in any complex organization. But blind adherence to obsolete customs, he believed, weakened the very power the Mafia sought to preserve. While the mustache Petes worshipped the old code, Luciano dissected it. He asked not what does omerta forbid, but what does omerta enable? His revision would reshape the underworld. A code reinterpreted to Luciano, omerta's true purpose was operational security, protect the organization by limiting exposure. What frustrated him was the way the old Mafia had weaponized the code to suppress progress and enforce ethnic purity. The rule against cooperating with outsiders, particularly Jews and Irish, was, in his eyes, a strategic handicap. Profit had no ethnicity. Networks required diversity. And efficiency demanded flexibility. Luciano's interpretation of omerta stripped it down to its core. Silence toward the authorities was non-negotiable. Loyalty to the organization was paramount, provided the organization served its members in return. Internal discipline must be rational, not ritualistic. Relationships should be judged by utility, not ancestry. This hybrid vision, part tradition, part modernization, was controversial, even revolutionary. For the old guard it was sacrilege. But for the younger generation it was liberation. He applied this revised omerta to every layer of his growing empire. Men were rewarded for competence rather than bloodline. Violence was codified, used only when strategically necessary. Alliances with Jewish syndicates were not violations of the code but expansions of its purpose. And decisions were made not according to ancient custom but according to the logic of business. In doing so, Luciano transformed omerta from a cultural artifact into a governance model. Loyalty redefined. The traditional Sicilian bosses believed loyalty belonged to the person of the boss. Luciano believed loyalty belonged to the institution. This was a radical shift. Under the old system, a boss's personal grudges, pride, and paranoia could dictate the fate of entire crews. A perceived slight could trigger a war. A challenge to authority could end in bloodshed. This personalization of power created instability, something Luciano understood was fatal for an expanding empire. He set out to build a structure in which loyalty flowed upward, downward, and laterally. Crews were interdependent. Disputes were arbitrated through the commission rather than through vendettas. Decisions benefited the collective, not the ego of one man. Luciano's reinterpretation of omerta enforced loyalty by making the organization worthy of loyalty. But this change came with a psychological cost. If loyalty no longer rested on tradition, it rested on results. And results, unlike tradition, could be questioned. Luciano's allies admired his vision, but they also recognized that his power was no longer mystical or inherited. It was constructed, negotiated, and therefore theoretically replaceable. His reformed omerta created extraordinary stability, but it also introduced a quiet, new tension. Loyalty to a system is powerful, but it is not eternal. Luciano never forgot that. The weight of silence. If loyalty was the spine of the Mafia, silence was its breath. Luciano understood silence as an asset that must be protected. Every deal, every alliance, every shipment required coordinated secrecy. The larger the empire grew, the more dangerous a single leak became. Traditional omerta had demanded silence at all costs, but Luciano refined it into a sophisticated operational principle. He expanded the code to include compartmentalization of information so no one man knew too much, predictable consequences for violations, replacing the arbitrary paranoia of older bosses, selective transparency within leadership circles to prevent misunderstandings and rogue behavior. Silence was no longer an act of fear, it was a function of efficiency. But even this reimagined omerta could not fully protect him. The very structure he created, more organized, more visible, more powerful, heightened the danger of exposure. The government, which once dismissed the Mafia as disorganized street thugs, began to take interest. Wiretaps, raids, grand juries, and intelligence units chipped away at the underworld's anonymity. The empire grew stronger. The shadows grew thinner. Reformer and heretic to the younger generation of mobsters, Luciano was a visionary, the man who transformed chaos into enterprise. But to the old guard, he was a heretic undermining sacred traditions. His willingness to collaborate across ethnic lines, to replace vendetta with negotiation, to treat crime as business rather than blood feud, was seen as a betrayal. Yet even his critics could not deny the results. Under Luciano, profits soared, violence decreased, and the Mafia's influence extended into every major city in America. His hybrid interpretation of omerta became the cultural baseline for modern organized crime. But the irony was unavoidable. The same code Luciano modernized would one day be the measure by which he was judged. And in the moment of his greatest need, when the government closed in, when enemies circled, when survival required a decision unprecedented in Mafia history, loyalty would become a question rather than a guarantee. Because Luciano had changed the code. And codes, once changed, can break in unexpected ways. By the early 1930s, Lucky Luciano had accomplished something unprecedented in American criminal history. He turned vice into infrastructure. What older gang bosses treated as scattered rackets, prostitution, gambling, narcotics, and labor extortion, he transformed into a coordinated national industry. Under Luciano, crime no longer resembled a series of neighborhood hustles. It resembled a corporation with divisions, managers, payrolls, and territory-wide strategies. He understood that criminal opportunity was not merely about breaking laws, it was about filling needs society refused to address openly. If there was desire, there was a market. And if there was a market, it could be systemized. Where others saw chaos, Luciano saw supply chains. Where others saw vice, he saw revenue. And where others saw risk, he saw leverage. Prostitution, from street chaos to organized circuit. Before Luciano's rise, prostitution was disjointed and unpredictable. Pimps controlled individual women violently, brothels operated independently, and profits evaporated through corruption or incompetence. Police raids were sporadic, payments inconsistent, and the women, exploited and unprotected, became liabilities as often as assets. Luciano believed disorganization was more dangerous than immorality. So he rebuilt the system from the ground up. He created an organized circuit, rotating workers through brothels in different neighborhoods so no single operation gained too much attention. Madams acted as managers, overseeing daily operations and reporting to regional supervisors. Violence was curtailed, not from compassion but because fear made workers unreliable and investigations more likely. A standardized payment structure ensured that money flowed predictably up the ladder. For the first time, prostitution in New York operated with logistical precision. Every brothel had quotas, every worker had a schedule, and every dollar had a destination. It was exploitation, industrialized and engineered for maximum profit. Gambling, the syndicate's cash engine. Gambling was America's universal vice. Italians, Jews, Irish, blacks, bankers, laborers, everyone wagered on something. But the industry was fragmented into countless small operations. Basement card games, alley dice tables, illegal bookmakers working out of barber shops, and racetrack fixers moving independently. Luciano saw enormous potential in unity. With Meyer Lansky as the architect of odds and mathematics, Luciano consolidated gambling into a network of corridors, each controlled by trusted lieutenants who ensured fair odds, reliable payouts, and constant cash flow. Bookmakers paid protection in exchange for stability. High-stakes games were overseen like private financial institutions. Even rival ethnic crews were invited to join the system, provided they followed its rules and paid their share. The brilliance lay in predictability. Gamblers trusted Luciano's operations more than legal ones. Payouts were guaranteed. Cheating was not tolerated. And most importantly, police presence could be bought and forecasted. Gambling became the syndicate's most stable income source, the beating heart of a machine that needed constant liquidity. Narcotics. The silent, dangerous pipeline. If prostitution and gambling were visible structures, narcotics were the invisible bloodstream of the underworld. Luciano approached the drug trade with caution. He understood both its profitability and the political firestorm it attracted. Unlike alcohol or gambling, narcotics sparked moral panic and aggressive federal enforcement. But he also understood demand. Rather than flood the streets recklessly, Luciano built compartmentalized pipelines. Raw morphine and heroin came from Europe, processed in hidden labs, and distributed through highly trusted intermediaries. No single lieutenant knew the full supply chain. This secrecy protected the empire. If one link broke, the others remained intact. Luciano limited distribution deliberately, avoiding excess that would provoke headlines. To him, narcotics were not a public menace, they were inventory. And inventory required regulation, not indulgence. This discipline set his operations apart from reckless dealers who overexpanded and drew federal wrath. Union control, crime's greatest power lever of all the systems Luciano built, his control of labor unions granted him the most far-reaching influence. Racketeering in unions was not merely about siphoning dues, it was about controlling the flow of the American economy. By infiltrating the docks, Luciano gained the ability to delay or expedite shipments. This gave him leverage over importers, exporters, and entire industries dependent on maritime trade. Through trucking unions, he influenced distribution routes. Through construction unions, he affected city contracts. Through political contributions, covert but powerful, he ensured that sympathetic officials sat in offices where decisions about policing and prosecution were made. Union control made Luciano untouchable in a way brute force never could. Business owners paid him not because they feared him, but because they feared what would happen without him. Strikes, delays, broken shipments, these were consequences he could engineer with a phone call. This wasn't crime. This was governance. Delegation. The corporate mafia takes shape. Luciano knew his empire could collapse under its own weight if he tried to manage everything personally. He ran his organization like a modern executive, delegating, reviewing, correcting, predicting. Frank Costello handled political relationships and high-level bribery. Vito Genovese oversaw enforcement, narcotics, and internal discipline. Meyer Lansky managed finances, investments, and the long-term strategy. Bugsy Siegel executed high-risk operations and expansion projects. Each lieutenant controlled a division rather than a territory. This decentralization made the system resistant to internal betrayal and external pressure. No one man, not even Luciano, held all the keys. But he held enough. Meetings were scheduled. Collections were reviewed. Decisions were made with the logic of businessmen, not bandits. Luciano cultivated a culture in which gangsters behaved like executives, because executives were harder to prosecute, harder to predict, and far more profitable. An empire too valuable to lose. By the height of his reign, Luciano's criminal infrastructure rivaled mid-sized corporations in revenue and exceeded many in influence. Prostitution, gambling, narcotics, and union manipulation fed into one another like interlocking gears. The national syndicate he built stretched from New York to Chicago, Miami to Los Angeles. It was an empire of shadows, but its impact reached daylight. And with visibility came danger. Federal prosecutors, reform-minded politicians, and an increasingly organized police force recognized that this was no longer street crime, it was a system. The very professionalism that made Luciano powerful also made him detectable. The government had finally found a target large enough, structured enough, and threatening enough to pursue relentlessly. Luciano realized that the empire he built with such precision could crumble under a single sustained assault. For a man who treated crime like industry, the government was the only competitor powerful enough to shut him down. Which begged the question, when a king realizes his empire is too large to hide, how far will he go to protect it? That question would lead Luciano to the most unconventional bargain of his life, one that blurred the line between criminal strategy and patriotic necessity. Power, in Lucky Luciano's world, was never something a man simply possessed. It was something he balanced, precisely, cautiously, like a blade held upright on its point. Allies kept that blade steady. Enemies tried to knock it over. And sometimes the greatest danger came from men who could be either one depending on the day. Nowhere was that more evident than in the complicated web of partnerships and rivalries Luciano navigated as he built his empire. He surrounded himself not with relatives or Sicilian loyalists, but with talent, men who could strengthen the syndicate in ways tradition never allowed. But surrounding himself with brilliant, ambitious men meant surrounding himself with potential betrayers. Luciano understood the bargain. The stronger his allies became, the more powerful the threats they could one day pose. The allies who strengthened the throne. Meyer Lansky, quiet and analytical, was the architect of Luciano's financial vision. He turned gambling into a science, predicting profit with a precision that seemed almost prophetic. While others saw criminal opportunity as improvisation, Lansky treated it like mathematics. Luciano trusted him more than anyone else, not because they were from the same background but because their minds aligned. Bugsy Siegel, fiery and bold, added force to the syndicate's brain power. Emotional, unpredictable, but fiercely loyal to Luciano and Lansky, Siegel acted as the syndicate's spear. When diplomacy failed or intimidation was required, Siegel delivered swift, uncompromising results. His charisma opened doors, his violence closed them when necessary. Frank Costello served as Luciano's political arm. With charm, tact, and an uncanny ability to influence legislators and lawmen, he built a protective shell around the empire, one made not of guns but of handshakes and campaign contributions. Where Siegel enforced, Costello insulated. Where Lansky calculated, Costello persuaded. Together these men fortified Luciano's rule. Yet each one introduced vulnerabilities as well. Power, once shared, becomes something that each participant quietly measures. Loyalty lasts only as long as ambition finds benefit. Vito Genovese. Ambition with a knife behind its back. No ally illustrated this truth more clearly than Vito Genovese. He and Luciano had grown up together, but childhood familiarity did not soften Genovese's hunger. He was cold, efficient, and shaped by an instinct for domination rather than cooperation. Where Luciano believed in alliances across ethnic lines, Genovese despised them. Where Luciano governed by structure, Genovese preferred fear. He saw Lansky as an outsider, Siegel as a reckless showman, Costello as a politician pretending to be a gangster. Most dangerously, he saw Luciano's vision of a commission, not a king, as weakness. Genovese believed he should be the undisputed boss. And though he lacked the subtlety to challenge Luciano openly, he waited for the perfect moment, any sign of vulnerability. Luciano understood that Genovese was both an asset and a threat. He relied on his brutality. He feared his ambition. In the Mafia, the man closest to you could be the one sharpening the knife behind your back. Genovese embodied that truth completely. Dutch Schultz, a threat too chaotic to control. If Genovese threatened Luciano from within, Dutch Schultz threatened him from without. Schultz controlled Harlem and parts of the Bronx, earning millions through bootlegging, numbers gambling, and intimidation. But unlike Luciano's calculated empire, Schultz ran his operations like a storm, violent, impulsive, and guided solely by his temper. His downfall came when prosecutor Thomas Dewey targeted him for tax evasion. Schultz, cornered and furious, demanded permission from the commission to assassinate Dewey. Luciano instantly recognized the disaster this would create. Killing Dewey would trigger national outrage and almost guarantee a government crusade against organized crime. The commission voted no. Schultz decided he would do it anyway. That defiance sealed his fate. Luciano understood that Schultz's recklessness posed a greater threat than any rival family. To protect the syndicate, Schultz had to be removed. He was gunned down in a Newark restaurant, a brutal but necessary execution. It was a reminder that sometimes the enemy is not the rival attacking your power, but the ally whose recklessness could burn down everything you've built. Salvatore Maranzano, the last attempt at old world rule before Luciano modernized the Mafia. The underworld was ruled by traditionalists like Salvatore Maranzano, a man still trapped in the feudal mentality of Sicily. After the Castellamarese War, Maranzano declared himself capo di tutti capi, boss of all bosses, expecting all others to bow. But Maranzano misunderstood the new landscape. America was not Sicily. Ambition was not contained by heritage. And Luciano was not a man who would remain subordinate for long. When Maranzano realized Luciano was too influential to control, he plotted to eliminate him. But Luciano struck first. Assassins disguised as federal agents stormed Maranzano's office and ended his reign. With his death, the old world died with him. From its ashes rose Luciano's commission, a modern structure built on reason, balance, and business, not ancient grudges and rigid feudalism. Yet the lesson haunted Luciano. Even a mentor can become a predator when power is at stake. The constant threat of betrayal. Luciano's empire was built on relationships, strong, strategic, and profitable. But every relationship carried risk. The allies who empowered him also had the ability to undermine him. The rivals he defeated left behind loyalists hungry for revenge. The ambitious men beneath him watched his every move, measuring when loyalty benefited them and when treachery might offer more. Luciano knew this intimately. His own rise to power had been fueled by carefully chosen betrayals. He could not expect the next generation to behave differently. Genovese waited for weakness. Schultz threatened stability. Maranzano tried to kill him. And others, quieter but no less dangerous, watched from the shadows. This was the knife's edge on which Luciano ruled, sharp, fragile, and always moments from tipping. And when the day came that the government closed in, and Luciano needed absolute loyalty to survive, he would discover that even the strongest alliances were vulnerable. Because in the world he built, betrayal was not an exception. It was tradition, modernized. By the mid-1930s, Lucky Luciano stood at the height of his empire, yet he had never been more vulnerable. Power had elevated him, but it had also magnified the forces gathering against him. The government had begun to evolve, sharpening its tools and coordination, while internal mafia tensions tightened like a slow-closing vice. What followed was a hidden war, fought not on streets or in alleyways, but in courtrooms, offices, and whispered conversations behind locked doors. Luciano sensed the shift before most men around him. The atmosphere of New York had changed. Politicians no longer denied the existence of organized crime. Newspapers printed it boldly, dramatizing the syndicate's power. Reformers demanded action. Prosecutors sought headlines. And ambitious lawmen, young, fearless, hungry, saw the mafia as their path to national prominence. The old underworld had been ignored because it was chaotic. Luciano's empire, however, was too efficient to overlook. Organization made it powerful. Organization made it visible. Visibility made it a target. The rise of Thomas Dewey, a new kind of enemy. The face of this new threat was Thomas E. Dewey, a relentless special prosecutor whose rise mirrored in many ways Luciano's own ascent. Dewey was disciplined, methodical, and intolerant of corruption. He pursued criminals the way Luciano built his empire, strategically, patiently, and with unwavering focus. Dewey understood something few prosecutors grasped. Luciano wasn't merely a gangster, he was the architect of a system. To destroy the system, the architect had to fall. He began by dismantling the lower layers, bookmakers, pimps, and union enforcers. Raids increased. Informants were pressured. Judges, previously shielded by Costello's influence, faced scrutiny. The protective web around Luciano thinned one thread at a time. And Dewey's methods were innovative. He used data, financial tracing, and coordinated raids to identify patterns. He built cases not from rumors but from ledgers, coded messages, and testimony forced through fear or desperation. For the first time, Luciano faced an enemy who approached crime the way he approached business, with logic, structure, and an appetite for results. Pressure from outside, political winds shift. The federal government, noticing Dewey's momentum, added its own weight to the campaign. Intelligence sharing increased. National papers depicted Luciano as the embodiment of moral decay, a symbol of everything America needed to purge. Even officials who once quietly benefited from mafia cooperation began to distance themselves. Luciano's political protection, so carefully cultivated by Costello, started to deteriorate. A whisper here, a vote there, a reshuffling of police leadership. The changes seemed small, but Luciano recognized their significance. Protection is strongest when invisible. When it begins to fade, everyone can see the void it leaves behind. Business owners who once relied on the mafia's influence hesitated to pay. Unions grew anxious. Street-level operations sensed the shift and became skittish. The empire still functioned, but unease had entered its bloodstream. Inside, the mafia loyalty froze at the edges while external pressure mounted. Another storm gathered inside the syndicate itself. Luciano had built the commission to avoid senseless wars, but he could not eliminate ambition, envy, or fear. Vito Genovese, patient as ever, sensed opportunity. The government's tightening grip made Luciano appear mortal, vulnerable. Genovese had always believed he should lead, and now he began quietly positioning himself as the heir apparent. He whispered to allies, questioned Luciano's judgment, and presented himself as the man who could restore the old world style of absolute authority. Men who felt threatened by Dewey's prosecutions, pimps, brothel managers, street captains, began to fear that Luciano's modern empire had grown too large to protect them. Some whispered about cutting their own deals. Others wondered if aligning with Genovese might secure their futures. The commission still stood behind Luciano, but unity was not as solid as it once seemed. Fear corrodes even the strongest bonds. Luciano understood this better than anyone. The paranoia takes hold, shadows everywhere. Luciano's meetings grew quieter. Conversations shorter. He noticed glances exchanged between men who once never looked at each other. Reports came in with more caution, less certainty. His lieutenants, men he trusted, felt the atmosphere tightening, even if they didn't speak of it. Every phone call sounded monitored. Every stranger looked suspicious. Every new rumor seemed crafted to unsettle him. He had risen through the Mafia by predicting danger, by seeing threats before they materialized. Now the threats came from all sides at once, too many to track, too coordinated to dismiss. There were days he wondered which would reach him first, the government's hand? Or a knife from within? The streets react, an empire under siege. As Dewey intensified his crusade, the underworld reacted with fear and anger. Raids disrupted revenue. Arrests created supply chain gaps. Money moved more slowly. Meetings were cancelled. Trusted lieutenants operated from hiding. The prostitutes in Luciano's circuit became prime targets, pressured to name names. Some broke. Some lied. Some disappeared. Each incident introduced new evidence, new speculation, new vulnerabilities. Gambling dens shut their doors earlier. Union leaders became wary of associating too closely with Costello. Narcotics channels temporarily froze to avoid detection. Luciano's great strength, coordination, became a liability when the entire system felt the shockwaves of government aggression. He knew he needed to tighten operations, reinforce loyalty, and project confidence. But confidence alone could not calm an empire sensing its leader was being hunted. Dewey closes in. The trap tightens. By 1935, Dewey had assembled a mosaic of evidence. Some accurate, some exaggerated, all damaging. Witnesses were found, intimidated or coerced, but enough of them spoke. Documents were traced. Ledgers were deciphered. And the media painted Luciano as the emperor of a vast prostitution syndicate, an image perfect for moral outrage and political victory. Luciano realized the danger had crossed a threshold. He could manage rivals, he could control unions, he could negotiate with other bosses, but he could not stop the machinery of a determined government backed by public fury. The hidden war was no longer hidden. It was coming for him openly. And for the first time in his career, Lucky Luciano felt the ground shift beneath his feet, not from betrayal, not from violence, but from a force he could not intimidate or negotiate with. A force that would drag him toward the fall he had feared for years. The tightening coil had closed. There was no more room to maneuver. The morning Lucky Luciano was arrested, New York City felt unusually still, as if the air itself were waiting for the blow that would shake the underworld. For years, Luciano had believed he understood the rhythm of danger. He knew how enemies approached, how threats evolved, how betrayal whispered before it struck. But the force that came for him now did not come from a rival family or an ambitious lieutenant. It came wrapped in the cold efficiency of government, precisely executed by a man determined to carve his name into history, Thomas E. Dewey. Luciano had been in Hot Springs, Arkansas, seeking space from the tightening noose in New York. The air was warm, the town quiet, but his instinct told him something was coming. Still, even he did not expect the sudden entrance of officers from multiple jurisdictions, bursting into his suite with arrest warrants, backed by Dewey's ironclad confidence. The move was theatrical, intentional, meant to broadcast one message: no king is untouchable. Luciano's arrest was not the result of a single witness or one piece of evidence. It was a mosaic constructed from fear, ambition, and betrayal, some coerced, some voluntary, some rooted in desperation. Dewey had built a case not by lifting stones but by turning men. And it worked. The government's trap, built from within the prostitution case that Dewey assembled against Luciano, was unprecedented. Prosecutors had rarely targeted leaders at the top of criminal networks. They focused instead on street-level offenders. But Dewey aimed upward, arguing that Luciano was the architect behind a sprawling prostitution syndicate. To make this leap, he needed testimony that connected Luciano directly to operations he normally kept at arm's length. The first cracks appeared among the brothel workers and managers. Many were terrified, of both the police and the Mafia, but Dewey's team applied relentless pressure. Some were offered protection. Others were offered deals. A few saw a chance to escape the underworld altogether. One woman, once loyal to Luciano's network, became the unlikely key witness. She described organizational structures, payments, rotations, details Luciano believed were buried behind layers of intermediaries. She claimed to have seen him give orders. Whether out of truth, pressure, or self-preservation, her testimony became the spine of Dewey's case. But government pressure alone could not explain the speed with which Dewey closed in. Something else, something deeper, had shifted inside Luciano's own empire. Someone was helping them. The betrayal, the quiet knife in the dark. Luciano had enemies his entire life, but he had always believed that loyalty within his inner circle was unbreakable. He had built his empire with cooperation, not fear. Yet it was precisely this cooperation that weakened him now. His organization was modern, structured, layered, and those layers created more places for fear to spread. Vito Genovese, marinating in resentment and ambition, had waited years for a moment when Luciano appeared vulnerable. Dewey's crusade was that moment. Genovese did not need to testify to betray Luciano. All he needed to do was step back, refuse to intervene, and allow the case to grow unchecked. Luciano felt it instinctively. The silence from Genovese's corner was too calculating, too calm. There were whispers that Genovese had quietly encouraged witnesses to cooperate, offering no direct support to Dewey, but removing barriers that once kept the government at bay. Some lieutenants, terrified of Dewey, stopped following protocols. Others withheld information. A few, small men Luciano barely knew, turned informant to save themselves. The empire that once moved like a perfectly tuned machine now shook with uncertainty. Luciano had built a system so efficient, so interconnected, that when fear entered its joints, the entire structure trembled. The trial, power reduced to a spectacle. Luciano's trial became a national spectacle. Newspapers called him the Vice King, the Emperor of Prostitution, the most dangerous man in America. Dewey capitalized on every headline. He presented Luciano not as a criminal, but as a mastermind, an invisible dictator manipulating the sins of a city from penthouses and nightclubs. Luciano sat in the courtroom outwardly calm. But beneath the surface something began to break. He had faced danger before, knives, bullets, gang wars, betrayals, but this was different. In the courtroom's cold air, he realized he could not intimidate a jury. He could not negotiate with a prosecutor. He could not bribe the public. For the first time, power slipped from his hands, and no amount of strategy could grip it again. Witness after witness described an empire Luciano had supposedly controlled directly. Many exaggerated, some outright lied. But the narrative was too compelling, too organized, too perfect. Dewey was painting a picture, and the jury believed every stroke. Luciano's lawyers fought aggressively, but the tide was against them. Every argument, every cross-examination felt like pushing against a rising wall of water. Luciano understood the truth long before the verdict was read. He had already lost. The psychological collapse. A king facing mortality. When the jury returned and declared him guilty on nearly all counts, Luciano did not flinch. He simply nodded, jaw clenched, eyes steady. But inside, the fall had begun long before the verdict. Sitting in his cell that night, he felt something he hadn't felt since his childhood in the slums: powerlessness. He replayed every decision, every alliance, every betrayal. Where had the chain broken? Who had failed him? Who had betrayed him first? Was it the witnesses? The brothel madams? The frightened intermediaries? Or was it Genovese, carefully stepping into the light left behind by Luciano's fall? The empire he built, modern, efficient, resilient, now felt distant, as if it belonged to someone else. He had always believed that he could predict the future, manipulate outcomes, control every variable. But he had never predicted this. He had underestimated the government's growing sophistication. He had underestimated Dewey's resolve. Most dangerously, he had underestimated the ambition quietly blooming within his own ranks. For a man who once controlled cities, ports, unions, and men's destinies, the realization was devastating. Power was not permanent. Loyalty was not absolute. Even a king could fall. And Luciano had only begun to fall. The courthouse steps were a battlefield long before the trial began. Reporters swarmed the entrance, cameras flashed like bursts of artillery, and crowds pressed against police lines, eager to witness the downfall of America's most infamous criminal mastermind. The People vs. Charles Luciano was not just a trial, it was a political spectacle, a public cleansing ritual, and prosecutor Thomas E. Dewey's defining moment. Dewey had crafted the case expertly. He wasn't hunting merely for a conviction. he sought a symbol. For years, the government had denied the existence of organized crime. Now, they needed a face to represent it, and Luciano, with his reputation for intelligence, influence and invisibility, was perfect. To dismantle him publicly was to claim victory over the underworld itself. Luciano walked into the courtroom with the poise of a man who refused to be diminished. Impeccably dressed, expression unreadable, he radiated the calm of someone long accustomed to danger. But beneath the surface he sensed the shift. This was not a war fought with bullets or alliances. This was a war of perception, and Dewey was winning it before a single witness spoke. The courtroom becomes Dewey's theater. Dewey understood audiences, both the jury and the country. His opening statement was less a legal argument and more a dramatic unveiling. He described Luciano as the dictator of vice, orchestrating a sprawling prostitution empire with corporate precision. The prosecution's language was vivid, emotional and intoxicating. Truth mattered, but narrative mattered more. Witnesses began to take the stand in rapid succession. Prostitutes, brothel madams, enforcers, all trembling under the weight of the moment. Many contradicted each other. Some exaggerated wildly. A few clearly told Dewey's version more than their own. But Dewey didn't need perfection. He needed momentum. Each voice reinforced the same image: Luciano as the silent architect behind everything. Luciano's defense team tore into the testimonies, exposing lies, inconsistencies, and implausible details. But the jury wasn't looking for precision. They were looking for justice, or what they believed justice to be. Every objection, every contradiction, was swallowed by the tide of public outrage outside the courthouse. The media fanned the flames outside. Newspapers declared Luciano guilty long before the verdict. Headlines blared, "Vice King exposed, Luciano's hidden empire, the man behind 1,000 women." Reform groups marched through Manhattan with signs demanding the harshest punishment imaginable. Dewey fed the frenzy masterfully. Each day he delivered sound bites that became the next morning's headlines. Politicians praised his courage. Religious groups treated the trial like a moral crusade. The city wanted a villain to blame for its corruption, and Luciano, wealthy, foreign-born, powerful, fit the role perfectly. The myth of Luciano's invincibility, built over years of careful secrecy, now worked against him. If he controlled everything, then he must also be responsible for every crime the prosecution described. The narrative was too irresistible for the public to question. Luciano watched the newspaper coverage from his cell each night, knowing the most dangerous battle was already lost: the battle for public opinion. The defense fights a war already decided. Luciano's lawyers made compelling arguments. They pointed out that no physical evidence tied him to the prostitution network. No intercepted messages, no documents, no direct orders. The case relied entirely on testimony, much of it unreliable. But Dewey countered with a simple, devastating message: Luciano was too smart to leave evidence. With that statement, he turned the absence of proof into proof itself. Logic had no place in Dewey's narrative. He had built a myth, and myths do not require documentation. Luciano felt the weight of it. He had always believed he could outthink anyone: gangsters, rivals, even fellow bosses. But Dewey was not a street adversary. He was a different breed: disciplined, calculating, and armed with the full moral outrage of the public. For the first time, Luciano realized intelligence alone could not save him. The verdict, a foregone conclusion when the jury returned, the silence was suffocating. Luciano glanced at their faces and saw what he already knew: fear, certainty, and moral righteousness. They were not judging a man. They were condemning an idea. Guilty on all major counts. Luciano did not move. He did not speak. The world erupted around him. Reporters scribbled furiously, spectators gasped. Dewey allowed himself a measured nod of satisfaction. In that moment, Luciano understood that he had not lost a legal battle. He had lost a war of perception. The sentencing, the symbolic execution. Days later, the courtroom filled again for sentencing. Judge Philip J. McCook delivered a speech that echoed through newspapers for years. He declared Luciano the embodiment of moral corruption, the head of a criminal empire that preyed on society. Then came the sentence: 30 to 50 years in state prison. It struck like a physical blow. Not because Luciano feared prison, he had survived worse dangers, but because the sentence represented the symbolic destruction of everything he had built. His empire required leadership, coordination, and constant vigilance. None of that could survive decades of confinement. For the government, the message was clear: the king is gone. The empire will crumble. The fall of a king as Luciano was escorted away, flashes from cameras lit the hallway like muzzle fire. He kept his head high, but inside, something irrevocable shifted. He had once commanded cities, unions, ports, industries. Now he was reduced to a prisoner in chains. In that moment, Luciano realized the ultimate irony. The criminal empire he built with intelligence, structure and innovation had been undone not by violence, not by rivals, but by a story, one powerful enough to turn a courtroom into a battlefield and a prosecutor into a hero. And for the first time in his life, Lucky Luciano understood that a legend could be a weapon. Even against the man who created it. Prison was designed to erase power. It stripped men of control, routine and identity. But Lucky Luciano did not enter Clinton Correctional Facility as an ordinary inmate. He walked in as a man who had once commanded cities, unions, ports and entire industries. Even behind bars, that aura did not disappear. It adapted. The guards sensed it, the inmates recognized it, and the administration quickly realized that Luciano was not a man who could be buried by walls. From his first days, Luciano observed everything with the calm of a strategist. He studied the rhythms of the prison. Who controlled the kitchen, who handled the laundry, which guards accepted small favors, which inmates influenced others. Instead of fighting for dominance, he let the ecosystem reveal its structure. Power existed everywhere, just distributed differently. Luciano began to build relationships quietly. He offered guidance, mediated disputes, and solved small problems for both inmates and guards. People gravitated toward him because he listened, calculated, and knew exactly what to say. He didn't command, he advised. And in a place where men felt forgotten, being heard was power. It didn't take long before inmates approached him for decisions that had nothing to do with crime, conflicts, debts, alliances. Luciano's mind became currency. His presence stabilized tensions that otherwise would have exploded. Without lifting a finger, he became an invisible authority inside the prison. The empire continues without its king outside the walls. Luciano's syndicate endured. Not flawlessly, nothing could function perfectly without its architect, but it survived because he had built it too. Frank Costello handled political relationships with skillful charm, ensuring that the Mafia's connections did not wither under Dewey's reforms. Meyer Lansky, ever the mathematician, kept the financial machinery steady and the gambling operations profitable. Communication between Luciano and his lieutenants was subtle but effective. Lawyers carried hints. Letters used coded phrasing. Visitors asked innocent questions whose answers carried strategic meaning. Luciano never issued direct orders, too dangerous, but he didn't need to. His men were shaped by his thinking. They anticipated what he would want in any situation. This autonomy was both a blessing and a danger. The structure held, but ambition stirred in the shadows. Luciano knew that imprisonment changed how some men perceived leadership. Absence creates opportunity, and opportunity attracts predators. No predator was more patient than Vito Genovese. From a distance, Genovese began aligning himself with those who doubted the syndicate's stability. He did not undermine Luciano openly, he wasn't foolish, but he allowed uncertainty to spread. Luciano felt it through every cautious letter, every clipped message, every silence where clarity once lived. Inside prison, Luciano understood the truth. He still held influence, but he no longer held fear. And without fear, enemies grew bold. The psychology of survival, where most prisoners surrendered to monotony, Luciano used incarceration to sharpen his mind. He reflected on past decisions, not with regret but as lessons. He studied the evolving political climate, the tone of newspapers, and the rising global tensions in Europe. He saw clearly that America was on the brink of something transformative. Sabotage threatened East Coast docks. Rumors of foreign agents circulated. German submarines prowled the Atlantic. New York's waterfront, long influenced by unions under Mafia sway, was becoming a national security concern. Luciano recognized a pattern. When institutions struggle, they turn to solutions outside the boundaries of convention. A thought took root, small but undeniable. The government that destroyed me may one day need me. It wasn't arrogance. It was logic. Fear spreads through the underworld as Dewey's reforms tightened. Lower-level members of the syndicate panicked. Some feared raids. Others feared Genovese. A few feared that Luciano's imprisonment meant the end of the commission's balance. Luciano felt a responsibility to keep order, even from confinement. His messages emphasized stability, patience, and loyalty. But he also understood that reassurance had limits. Men who lived by profit and instinct could only be controlled so long by words smuggled through lawyers. Still, the organization held. Not because fear bound it but because Luciano's legacy did. The syndicate functioned because he had built it with logic, not superstition, structure, not chaos. But structure alone could not stop the storm that was forming beyond the prison walls. War approaches, and the government watches. By early 1942, America was fully drawn into World War II. The country needed its supply lines secure. It needed its ports functioning with absolute reliability. And it needed to eliminate the possibility of sabotage along the waterfront. Navy intelligence officers, federal agents, and state officials all confronted the same problem. The docks were controlled, directly or indirectly, by the Mafia. Investigations showed something startling. The only man who had the relationships, the respect, and the influence to stabilize the waterfront was serving a decades-long sentence. Lucky Luciano. It was an idea that should have been impossible. Yet desperation often forces governments to consider unthinkable alliances. Before long, word reached the prison in hushed tones. First through guards, then visitors, then through subtle shifts in how officials treated Luciano. Meetings ran longer. Conversations grew more polite. Requests took on a tone of negotiation rather than control. Luciano understood instantly. The world had changed. The country needed him. And the moment he had predicted, the moment he had been quietly preparing for, was finally approaching. A king waiting in chains. Luciano was still behind bars, but the walls around him no longer seemed as solid. Opportunity, once stripped from him, was taking shape again on the horizon. Not in the form of escape. Not in the form of rebellion. But in the form of a request, one only he could fulfill. He had lost his empire. He had lost his freedom. But he had not lost the one thing that made him dangerous, his mind. And soon the U.S. government would come knocking, unwilling partners in a war neither side could afford to lose. When World War II erupted and German submarines began slicing through the Atlantic supply routes, America discovered that one of its greatest vulnerabilities lay not overseas, but at home, on the docks of New York. These waterfronts, chaotic and corrupt, had always been a maze of labor politics, union rivalries, and underworld influence. But with the nation now dependent on constant, uninterrupted shipments, the docks became a matter of national survival. Fires broke out without explanation. Supply crates vanished. Rumors of Axis agents infiltrating longshore unions spread like wildfire. And when the French luxury liner Normandy mysteriously caught fire and overturned in New York Harbor, panic swept through military intelligence. The government reached a startling conclusion. They could not secure the waterfront without the cooperation of the Mafia. And at the top of that world, even imprisoned, sat Lucky Luciano. The crisis deepens. Naval intelligence examined the structure of the docks and realized that the longshoremen trusted the Mafia more than the government. Luciano's influence, despite his prison sentence, still echoed through the unions. His lieutenants, Albert Anastasia on the docks, Frank Costello in politics, maintained order through fear, loyalty, and negotiation. Officials faced a choice: fight a war on two fronts, one against the Axis, the other against the underworld, or make a secret, uncomfortable alliance. In a closed-door meeting, one officer finally said what everyone else avoided: we should talk to Luciano. Not to pardon him. Not to praise him. But because they needed what only he could provide: control over the docks. The first contact, A. King, still holding court, an intelligence officer, arrived at Clinton Correctional Facility under the guise of an inspection. Inside a small interview room, he found Luciano seated calmly, radiating the same quiet authority he carried on the streets. The officer outlined the crisis: sabotage, fear, disloyalty, the threat of German spies, the instability among the unions. Luciano listened without expression. He asked precise questions. Which docks were most vulnerable? Which unions were most unsettled? What intelligence gaps concerned the Navy? It became clear immediately that Luciano's understanding of the docks surpassed that of the government. He knew which workers could be trusted, which foremen were vulnerable to bribery, which families had relatives in Sicily who could provide information about Mussolini's forces. Then came the question the officer dreaded asking: would you help us? Luciano did not answer immediately. He smiled faintly, the smile of a man who had predicted this moment long before the government realized they would need him. Operation Underworld, the secret pact. The collaboration that followed became known, years later, as Operation Underworld. At the time, almost no one knew it existed. Luciano could not make calls or sign orders openly, but he didn't need to. From prison, through intermediaries, lawyers, and coded messages, he ensured a chain of communication stretched from his cell to the waterfront. He instructed Lansky to assemble a quiet, reliable network to coordinate with naval officers. Anastasia mobilized dock workers, guaranteeing cooperation. Union leaders who had once resisted federal oversight now complied instantly. Suspicious figures disappeared. Strikes ceased. The flow of supplies became smooth and predictable. And most remarkably, sabotage, real or feared, vanished almost overnight. The government had asked for stability. Luciano delivered efficiency. But Operation Underworld extended far beyond New York's docks. The Allies planned an invasion of Sicily, and intelligence from the island was scarce. Luciano, through family connections and criminal networks, facilitated contact with anti-fascist Sicilian leaders. Whether those connections tipped key moments in the invasion remains debated, but officials privately acknowledged that the Mafia's cooperation eased the Allied landing. In the shadows, an imprisoned gangster had influenced a global war. The negotiation. A master strategist at work, Luciano never approached this alliance as a favor. He approached it as a negotiation. And he negotiated like a man who once built the most powerful criminal organization in America. He didn't demand immediate freedom. That would have been unrealistic. Instead, he argued for recognition, for consideration, for a future opportunity. He requested protection for cooperative union leaders, a halt to unnecessary investigations into his associates during the war, fair treatment for Sicilian immigrants suspected of disloyalty, and, crucially, a reassessment of his sentence once the war ended. The government, wary but desperate, agreed in principle. No promises were written, but everyone understood the deal. Luciano gave them stability. Luciano gave them Sicily. Luciano gave them results. In return, the government would consider freedom. Even Dewey, who once sought to destroy Luciano's empire brick by brick, could not deny the impact of Operation Underworld. After the war, Dewey himself endorsed clemency. The irony was staggering. The man who ended Luciano's reign now recommended his release. Freedom in exile, the price of survival in 1946, the state-approved commutation. Luciano walked out of prison not as a pardoned man, but under the condition of deportation to Italy. Reporters bombarded him with questions. How had he convinced the government to free him? What did he give them? Did he still run the Mafia? Luciano said nothing. Silence was his final act of mastery. He boarded the ship voluntarily. Exile was not defeat. It was leverage. In Italy, he would remain connected, influential, respected by those who understood that a king loses neither his crown nor his mind simply because he has been relocated. Operation Underworld had done more than shorten his sentence. It had preserved his legacy, his influence, and his myth. No criminal boss before him had ever negotiated with a world superpower. None had ever turned imprisonment into opportunity. None had ever walked out of a 30 to 50-year sentence after just 9 years. Luciano did. The emotional and strategic climax as he stood on the deck of the ship, the American coastline fading behind him, Luciano reflected on the impossible arc of his life. From a street kid in the slums to the architect of a national empire to a prisoner to a wartime asset whose influence reached from New York to Sicily. He had survived betrayal, prosecution, exile, and war. He had bargained with the very government that once vowed to destroy him. And he had shaped history in ways the public would not understand for decades. That was the final deal. Not for freedom alone, but for immortality. Lucky Luciano had lost his empire on paper. But through Operation Underworld he ensured the one empire that mattered most, his legacy, would never fall. When Lucky Luciano stepped onto the dock in Naples in 1946, he was free in body but exiled in every meaningful sense. America had released him only to remove him, and Italy received him with a mixture of suspicion and political caution. Surveillance followed him everywhere. Officials regarded him not as a returning immigrant, but as a dangerous legend whose very presence threatened public order. He settled into a modest apartment overlooking the Bay of Naples. The sea glittered, children played in the narrow streets, and fishermen worked as they had for centuries. Yet the peaceful scenery only deepened the emptiness inside him. Luciano had lived his entire life surrounded by action, strategy, and influence. Now for the first time he was a spectator to his own fading relevance. Letters and coded messages flowed in from America. They brought updates, some hopeful, some unsettling, about the empire he had built. The commission still operated. Money still moved. His philosophy still guided decisions. But he was no longer the force that shaped outcomes. Everything came to him secondhand, filtered, incomplete. And every report reminded him of the one truth he hated most. He was losing control of the world he created. The Cuban resurgence. A brief return to power by 1947, hope appeared in the form of Havana. Meyer Lansky, always loyal, quietly arranged Luciano's entry into Cuba. With bribes and political favors, Luciano found himself in a country close to the United States but outside its direct reach, a perfect middle ground for a man trying to reclaim influence. In Havana he felt a spark of his old power. Casinos glittered, money flowed freely, and the island buzzed with criminal opportunity. American mobsters flew in to meet him, pay respects, and hear his guidance. Luciano presided over the Havana Conference like a returning monarch, analyzing alliances, balancing narcotics routes, settling disputes with the clarity only he possessed. For a moment, it seemed as if exile had not defeated him. But power attracts attention. American intelligence soon noticed a rise in drug trafficking patterns and linked them to Luciano's presence in Cuba. The U.S. demanded his expulsion. The Cuban government, eager to maintain good relations with Washington, arrested him and placed him on a ship back to Italy. As the ship pulled away, Luciano felt the sting of an undeniable truth. He could influence minds, but he could no longer control geography. The struggle of a man built for power back in Italy under even tighter watch, Luciano faced a challenge far more painful than prison: the realization that he was becoming irrelevant. He tried to reinsert himself into narcotics operations in Europe. He attempted to reconnect with Sicilian bosses. He analyzed every shift in American leadership. But each attempt ran into the same walls: surveillance, age, and the natural evolution of an empire that no longer needed his direct hand. He had created a system so strong that it survived without him. This was both his greatest achievement and his deepest torment. Luciano walked the streets of Naples like a ghost who remembered every detail of a life he could no longer inhabit. His ambition still burned, sharp and restless, but the battlefield had moved beyond his reach. Younger men made decisions now. Bosses he had once mentored now mentored others. The world he shaped still thrived, yet he was forced to watch from afar. The empire outlives the emperor. Despite the frustration of exile, Luciano recognized a quiet victory. His structure held. The five families still followed the outlines he created. The commission still prevented senseless wars. Negotiation still outranked vendetta. Order still triumphed over chaos. He had designed organized crime as a corporation, not a monarchy, and because of that, it continued to operate effectively long after he was removed. His influence became architectural, woven into the foundations rather than dictated from above. Luciano understood that he had succeeded in a way few leaders ever do. He built something that no longer required him to survive. He had become a legend, the blueprint behind a living machine. The final years, a quiet farewell to power as age settled into his bones, Luciano spent his days in simple routines: walking the waterfront, talking with neighbors, smoking endlessly, and rereading old letters from the United States. Journalists and filmmakers visited him, hoping to capture the mystique of a man who had shaped history from the shadows. He entertained them, but each conversation reminded him of the gap between what he had been and what he had become. He followed American crime news obsessively. Each shift in leadership, each conflict between families, each new alliance triggered the strategist inside him. He remained mentally sharp, capable of predicting moves like a chess master, but he could no longer play the game. This more than exile broke his heart. On January 26, 1962, Luciano arrived at the Naples airport for a meeting with a film producer interested in telling his life story. Moments after greeting the man, Luciano collapsed and died of a heart attack. It was a strangely fitting end: public, sudden, and surrounded by people who knew his name but not his soul. He died far from the streets that crowned him king, yet the empire he built continued turning in his absence. A dawn without borders, a legacy without death. Luciano's final years were marked by fading influence, but his ideas never faded. His organizational model became the backbone of modern organized crime. His leadership philosophy shaped generations. His final deal with the U.S. ensured that he remained relevant in history even when geography confined him. He lost power. He lost territory. But he never lost legacy. And in the end, that legacy, not the throne, not the territory, not the wealth, became the true empire Lucky Luciano left behind. Lucky Luciano's life ended far from the American streets where he forged his empire, yet his influence only deepened after his death. His wartime cooperation, the clandestine Operation Underworld, became one of the most controversial and transformative chapters in the history of organized crime. It was a moment when criminal power, government necessity, and global conflict collided, reshaping the Mafia's future and altering the way intelligence agencies handled covert threats. Luciano's pact with the U.S. government represented more than a strategic decision. It marked the moment when the Mafia crossed a threshold from domestic criminality into geopolitical relevance. Though the details of the operation were shrouded in secrecy for decades, the consequences were unmistakable. Luciano had helped secure America's wartime ports and facilitated contacts for the Allied invasion of Sicily. In return, he won an early release and a level of legitimacy no criminal had ever achieved. But the pact carried a double-edged legacy, both tarnishing and fortifying his name. To traditionalists within the Mafia, cooperation with the government violated the spirit of omerta. Even if done for strategic reasons, talking to authorities was seen as betrayal. Rival bosses whispered that Luciano had compromised the very code he once enforced. His exile deepened these suspicions, and some claimed the commission kept its distance in later years because they feared the implications of aligning too openly with a man who had negotiated with the government. Yet his detractors understood something they rarely admitted. Only someone of Luciano's intelligence and influence could have made such a deal. And only he could have survived it with his legend intact. Redefining organized crime before Luciano, the Mafia in America often operated like a collection of tribal networks, fragmented, violent, and reactive. His creation of the commission and his corporate approach to crime fundamentally changed the structure of the underworld. But Operation Underworld added a new dimension. It proved that organized crime could intersect with global events. Luciano's cooperation during World War II demonstrated three groundbreaking realities. The Mafia could function as an intelligence network. His connections in Sicily and among dockworkers provided a form of human intelligence the government lacked. Organized crime could influence international strategy. The Allies' smoother entry into Sicily, aided by Mafia contacts, suggested a covert partnership between criminal elements and military planners. The Mafia was no longer merely a domestic threat. It had become a transnational force capable of shaping political outcomes. In a strange twist of history, Luciano helped elevate the Mafia from a local underworld into a global entity. Intelligence agencies took notice. After the war, both American and European operatives approached criminal networks differently, sometimes as adversaries, sometimes as tools. Luciano had blurred the line between national security and organized crime. A tarnished reputation that became myth for many Americans, Luciano's release was a national scandal. Newspapers questioned how a man once branded the dictator of vice could walk free. Dewey's endorsement of clemency shocked the public. For decades, rumors swirled that Luciano had manipulated the government, outwitted the system, and walked into freedom using wartime chaos as leverage. But scandal only fed Luciano's mythology. His story became a testament to strategic brilliance. A man capable of negotiating with a world superpower while sitting behind bars. His downfall had been public, but his resurgence was hidden, known only to intelligence officials and underworld elites. This secrecy added mystique, transforming the pact into legend. Some saw him as a traitor. Some saw him as a patriot. Others saw him as a mastermind who used circumstance to reshape his legacy. He was, in truth, a blend of all three. The global impact Luciano's influence extended long beyond his exile. The systems he created, alliances across ethnic lines, structured governance, revenue diversification, and the normalization of negotiation, became cornerstones of international organized crime. His model spread through Latin America, Europe, and even Asia, echoing in the rise of cartel hierarchies and transnational criminal networks. Operation Underworld also altered how intelligence agencies viewed unconventional partnerships. In the Cold War years that followed, governments increasingly relied on covert allies, criminal or otherwise, to influence regions where official channels failed. Luciano's pact became an early example of realpolitik, security over purity, results over image. His final deal was not an exception. It was a prototype. The legacy that would not die. Though Luciano died in exile, his legacy persisted in three powerful ways. His organizational blueprint remained the backbone of the American Mafia. His wartime cooperation became a symbol of criminal pragmatism. His legend proved that a single deal could outlive the man who made it. In the end, the pact that saved Luciano's freedom also ensured that his name would never fade. He reshaped the Mafia not through brute force but through strategy. He influenced global intelligence without wearing a uniform. And he proved that power, when wielded intelligently, can survive exile, scandal, and even death. Lucky Luciano's final act was not merely survival, it was transformation. He redefined what a Don could be, and in doing so he redefined organized crime for the world.